At the end of this session, I would ask any graduate students, those taking auditing on a regular or a casual basis in any graduate department, to wait behind for a few moments so that we could discuss with Professor Fitting how the discussion group could function and where it could meet. I'll remind you of this at the end of the session. Over to you.
Okay, yeah. I understand we're not supposed to have a blackboard here, and thus I can't draw these diagrams. We might be able to do this with some large piece of paper next time, but it's a matter of some anxiety for me since, as I said last time, there's something sort of reassuring about being able to scribble a picture of whatever you're talking about, or list a few subjects, so I'll have to convey these pictures to you in a kind of semi-oral fashion, and also remind you of some of the subjects that, or themes in a kind of musical sense of this course, as we had had a kind of introduction to them last time. They are, in no special order, the problem of interpretation, and that's a problem which, as you'll see shortly, I want to refocus in terms of the problem of ideological analysis, the problem of the nature of representation, the nature of the subject in the psychoanalytic sense, as it's taken in France today, and the value of that for the kind of criticism we're interested in. And finally, essentially the nature of historiography, at least in connection with Foucault. I think that's how we would want to describe this way of interrogating his book, which is essentially, as we began to see last time, one possible description of how the modern world comes into being, of that immense transformation which is the emergence of the modern world, and which then has all kinds of effects on language, literature, and forms, and everything else. The theme of historiography then is a way of interrogating Foucault's description of that process and asking ourselves what it means to write such a history, such a global history, to try to say how the very totality of things was transformed. Is this a narrative? And if so, what is the status of a historical narrative of this kind? And obviously that question about historical narrative is going to be related then ultimately to the status of history itself, as it will be called back into question by people like Derrida. So that's another long-term theme of this course. Now, the other subject that I want to deal with in some detail today, I think, was not brought up maybe as such last time. I call it the problem of levels. I don't know whether that means anything to you, or the problem of mediations, but I think we'll see what that is very shortly. Okay, now I'm anxious in the kind of discontinuous progress we hope to make here. I'm anxious at some point to shift gears and talk about the text of Flaubert that many of you have begun to read. We didn't get to do that last Friday. We probably won't get to do it today, but I would hope to get to it tomorrow. Let me just, to satisfy my own impatience at least, say a word or two about the framework that we're going to be looking at that in, and then come back to our more immediate subjects for today. I think one can say something like this, that although, well, let's go back even further. Aristotle says in the Poetics that the unity of a work comes from its imitating not a life, not the things that happen to a character, but rather an action. Because an action has a unity, but a life doesn't have any unity. It doesn't have any unity necessarily, I suppose, and indeed it doesn't have any unity no matter how you look at it, since it's a mere kind of temporal segment. Now we can say that before the 19th century, there were certainly narratives organized around people's lives, but they were considered exceptional lives. That is, when not the kind of biography of which I guess Plutarch is the kind of dominant form. Then in books like memoirs, you have the lives of the illustrious, and lives which are, as the title suggests, which present something which is memorable and thus out of the ordinary. And we'll come back at some point, I hope, to this question of of how in this classical pre-19th century period that Foucault, among others, is dealing with here, how the memorable is understood. What is, for example, the source of the novel itself? Something which is new, which is surprising. An unerhörte Begebenheit, how does one want to translate that? An event that's out of the ordinary. How does this? What is a category like that? The category of the surprising, of the astonishing, of the new, and what relations does it entertain with the way life is ordinarily felt to unfold, which is therefore habitual or cyclical or whatever. At any rate, when one comes to this, all changes, it seems to me, when we come to the modern world. Whether, no matter how one wants to describe again this change, whether one wants to describe it in terms of the humanization of the world, in the sense of the transformation, increasing transformation of nature into city, factory, work, the increasing role of measurement and grid work in the organization of what before that was simply felt to be other, and so forth. However one wants to describe the emergence of the modern world, of capitalism, it seems clear that the older kind of life rhythms, in terms of which you could have a sudden remarkable event that was memorable, that you would want to tell about, which would somehow form the nucleus of a tale. This has disappeared, and something else has to take its place, and obviously new literary forms come into being, essentially the novel itself and what I guess is generally called realism, to try to master the new kinds of organization of experience and time and so forth. But with naturalism, and here Flaubert is the inventor of a lot of what will later become the forms of naturalism, all of a sudden we have something. Is it a return or is it something new? The organization of literary works around lives again. That is, you have stories which run, if not from birth to death, then at least from youth to death, in which suddenly you no longer have. This is not the case, for example, in Balzac. It seems to me there's nothing. Even things like Le Père Goriot are not the story, the life story of Le Père Goriot. They're organized around a unity of action. But with Madame Bovary, and then in a very stylized kind of quintessential form in the Three Tales, suddenly it's as though either there were a regression to older forms of interest in human life as destinies, or maybe the emergence of something new, in the sense that these lives, which will be told about by the Goncourt and by Zola and so forth, are then no longer the remarkable lives of the memoirs, but are the average or lower than average lives of city people or workers of various kinds. or servants. So it's in that, that's the context in which I want to look at, initially look at three tales, to see what the relationship is between this formal transformation, between the emergence of a kind of narrative which marks a radical transformation of the novel as it existed at that point, and which will then be developed into a kind of immensely successful narrative matrix, first in the naturalist paradigm, and then beyond that in today's bestseller, which immediately takes over and uses this paradigm like a kind of that's why the word matrix is somehow useful, to suggest things being stamped out in series by a form of this kind. So this new form that we're going to look at in Flaubert has known a kind of immense historical fortune that it will be interesting to look at. But at the same time, we want to see whether we can talk about this formal transformation in terms of transformations of the raw material which are given form by the new type of narrative. And thus we want to see whether, and this will be, if you like, a first kind of approach to the problem of levels, whether it's possible to devise a criticism which can do justice to this work on several levels, which can see it as a symptom of all kinds of new developments in social raw material and social organization, social experience. I don't like the word sociological because it seems to me that presupposes a whole cut and dried set of things in advance that we don't necessarily want to presuppose. But in other words, whether it's not possible, on the one hand, to use Flaubert not as a document in the older sense, that is, we're not interested in and indeed it would be sort of silly to use un cœur simple, for example, to tell us about the life of the transformation of a certain peasantry into servants in the early 19th century or mid-19th century, but as a symptomatic or symptomal expression of social change on the one hand, and then on the other to read it on a different level as the transformation of a form. So this question, I think, will approach, I want to do that tomorrow, will approach from the point of view of the form of a life story or a destiny as a totality. That is, how can a life be made to be complete? How can it be removed from that totality of human relations that it inevitably belongs to, and somehow separated out and given a kind of closure, to use a word which is very much in vogue now and which is very useful, because certainly what marks these things is the way in which there's a kind of formal closure about the narrative. But how is that possible, since lives don't exist in that kind of closure? Okay, so much for as a kind of preface to tomorrow's discussion. Now, this illustration, though, I think gives us can give us an initial approach to the question of interpretation that I meant to raise, that I began to raise last time, and that I mean to raise in more directly today, because what we're saying then is it not possible to invent some new way of interpreting un cœur simple, in which the literary text wouldn't be reduced to anything, but whereby it would be understood as having a kind of larger meaning, a kind of larger resonance, which has to be somehow restored to it, which we don't notice in it at first glance, partly because, well, for a number of reasons. First of all, because this work is distant from us in time, and therefore whole parts of its context or its subtext, whatever you want to call it, have essentially disappeared and have to be replaced, reconstructed. I think anybody knows that, you know, who books are much harder to place, for example, in films, where now that we build up in the history of film, now that there is a kind of distant past by now in the history of film, when you see 30s movies, there is a kind of built-in historicity about them, owing to the fact of people's of cars, people's clothing styles, haircuts, and all the rest of it, so that there's already a kind of imperative to restore a kind of a historical context, which a book can't really enforce in that same way. So we're tempted. This comes to us with a kind of unity of its own, which doesn't really ask us to restore anything, and which therefore can function as a way of at least forgetting the context, if not repressing it. Then too, there's a matter of cultural distance involved, and so forth. So for all these reasons, we're beginning to suggest that one of the ways we should think of interpretation is by way of a restoration of a content, of a context, which the work had originally, which it still has in some way, but which has become invisible to us for all kinds of reasons, which are essentially those of historical distance, and also historical proximity, in the sense that this still seems meaningful without its context, whereas if you go further back and have to deal with texts that are radically different from that come from a generic system, for example, it's radically different from our own. At that point, you realize that you're faced with an enigma that has to be solved. That you can't. There's no question of a kind of automatic translation of this into your own terms. But with these works, which, as I said, are still those of our own world of discourse, since that is, by which I mean not realism but naturalism and the bestseller, since these works are the very source of mass art today, this is a discourse which is still ours in some sense, which is still familiar, and hence can give rise to this kind of optical illusion of completeness, the optical illusion that we do understand something which in fact doesn't have content for us. Okay, now I want to read you now, to develop this question of interpretation a little further. I want to read you a text of Paul Ricoeur, and then I want to say a few things, because Foucault's order of things is also helpful in its scheme of the various moments of recent intellectual history. It's helpful in suggesting that to each of these, what he calls epistemes, corresponds a different type of interpretive act. And I think whatever we may ultimately decide about this periodization scheme of Foucault's, it may be helpful to sort out the different interpretive possibilities which he sees as being implicit in these, essentially these three epistemes that he's dealing with. First, let me read this section from Ricoeur. These are things he said a number of times in a number of places, but I think the best discussion is still that in his book De l'Interprétation, which is translated Freud and Philosophy, and the opening chapters of which are, I think, a very good introduction to the whole question of hermeneutics, the problem of hermeneutics, the problem of interpretation, so on. This is what Ricoeur says, at least in part. The polarized opposition, he's talking about the polarized opposition that creates the greatest tension at the outset of his investigation into hermeneutic styles. According to one poll, hermeneutics is understood as the manifestation and restoration of a meaning addressed to me in the manner of a message, a proclamation, or as is sometimes said, a kerygma. According to the other poll, it is understood as a demystification, as a reduction of illusion. This tension, this extreme polarity, these are the two basic models, in other words, of the interpretive process. This extreme polarity is the truest expression of our modernity. The situation in which language today finds itself comprises this double possibility, sorry for this translation, comprises this double possibility, this double solicitation and urgency. On the one hand, to purify discourse of its excrescences, to liquidate the idols, to go from drunkenness to sobriety, to realize our state of poverty once and for all. This is, I suppose, the interpretation in terms of message. On the other hand, to use the most nihilistic, no, I beg your pardon, the first description is that of demystification, to liquidate the idols, and this ties in the recent tradition of demystification, and for him it's obviously Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, with its origins, for example, in Bacon. On the other hand, and this then is his version of the restorative hermeneutic, to use the most nihilistic, destructive, iconoclastic movement so as to let speak what once, what each time was said, when meaning appeared anew, when meaning was at its fullest. Hermeneutics seems to me to be animated by this double motivation: willingness to suspect, willingness to listen, vow of rigor, vow of obedience. In our time, we've not finished doing away with idols, and we've barely begun to listen to symbols. Of course, the whole question of symbols is Ricoeur's version of what he calls the positive hermeneutic. This is the hermeneutics of negative hermeneutics, positive hermeneutics, the hermeneutics of suspicion or doubt, and the hermeneutics of restoration. And I think, indeed, it would be important to open a kind of dialogue with Ricoeur's formulation of this positive hermeneutic. As far as the negative hermeneutic is concerned, it's clear that that's what one can call ideological analysis, essentially. And we'll see a little later how Foucault will account for the appearance of ideological analysis in in recent times as part of the whole relationship of science to humanism and to the idea of the human being or of man, since that foundation for these sciences then it constantly requires a kind of action first of all, it implies something which is not known, implies something which is unconscious, and thus a kind of constant questioning of whether of the boundaries of knowledge, and an attempt to well, more than purify, I think, to question, to put to interrogation the various experiences or ideas we may have in the light of all of the things which may disqualify them, and these would then be, among others, the class consciousness of Marx, the will to power of Nietzsche, and the Freudian unconscious. Now, I think there are other forms that Ricoeur is important, I think, not for having spelled out the nature of negative hermeneutics, because I think that's only too familiar to us in contemporary thought, since it's omnipresent, that kind of movement, whether these various versions of a negative hermeneutic have been ever adequately put into relationship with one another is another question. But those things, that movement of questioning, of doubting, of demystifying, it seems to me is very familiar. What's much less familiar, of course, is what he's calling a positive hermeneutic here, or hermeneutic of restoration. And it's very clear that in Ricoeur, the language of this hermeneutic is a religious, a theological language. The kerygma is understood as a message which is addressed to me. As such, it's possible to see, that is, it's a way that the text, it's a way of somehow arriving at that part of the text which does speak to me and which normally is invisible to me or is muffled or is hidden or whatever. As such, we'll see that there's some sort of interesting and surprising similarities between Ricoeur's description of how the kerygma operates and what some of these other writers have described in terms of the subject itself and the way the subject operates. I think that that's not the only kind of description one can give of the hermeneutics of restoration, though. And I think it may be well to think of other forms that can be taken by this return to the classical notion of hermeneutics, that is the uncovering of what the text really means, which is buried under time, the alien language that the text is written in, and so forth. Now, I'm going to do that. I'm going to try to make an approach to a more, to my mind, more complicated and interesting and more secular description of what a positive hermeneutics might be by going back, indeed, to the original theological models of these things. But I want to do this partly in terms of some of the motifs in Foucault. I think we were able very rapidly to go through some of this material on Friday morning, but I don't think everyone is here, so I may briefly recapitulate some of these the things that we did, and in particular the organization of the order of things around these three or four, it's not clear, basic epistemes, basic temporal historical periods. The first, to which we're going to return in a minute, is the episteme of the Renaissance or of the Middle Ages. It's not clear to what degree this is localized in time, to what degree, indeed, it can't stand for a whole style of maybe pre-capitalist or theological or religious sacred culture in general, and needn't at all be limited to the Western Middle Ages or Renaissance. Then something far more temporally and historically bound, what he calls the classical episteme, the moment of representation, which is the 17th and 18th centuries. And I think we pointed out that this is, for us, in the Anglo-American tradition, a kind of odd periodization, in that this corresponds to French absolutism and to the Ancien Régime, but it doesn't correspond to anything quite as clear in the English tradition. And so we have some real problems, I think, about what to do with this very, in some ways, very ethnocentric description of Foucault when we try to generalize it on a larger scale. And this will be the interest for us of the book on prisons, where indeed Foucault is obliged then to break up his own, break up this rigid scheme and do something else with it. Now, the episteme of representation, maybe I should run through that very fast right now so as not to keep coming back to it all the time. On the board, the image would be something like this. You have three levels, which are, for Foucault, the three basic areas in which one could observe this classical episteme at work. These levels are that of discourse, which is organized in this period in the, or which the fundamental kind of model is the general grammar Grammaire Générale of Port-Royal. Then there is a level which is that of not yet biology, but of natural history. And finally, there's a level of the analysis, what's not yet economics, but what's the analysis of riches or wealth, as in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And all of these three levels are apparently homologous with each other. That is, in each one is governed by the same, well, what shall we call it, patterning system. Now, Foucault, when he describes what an episteme is, will tend, not exclusively, but most often to say, well, it's a historical, it's an a priori of knowledge in a given period. That is, this is the way, the features I'm going to outline in a second, are the only way in which this so-called classical period can conceive of knowledge. And everything that that can't be accommodated by this scheme will be felt to be outside of knowledge somehow, something else, whatever. Because after all, and that wouldn't necessarily have to be organized, because there are lots of things floating around in our own cultural atmosphere which are unclassifiable, of which one only knows that they're not scientific and so forth. So for much of the time, Foucault is tempted. We see this as a kind of, you remember that Ricoeur said of structuralism that it was a Kantianism without a transcendental subject. And from this point of view, Foucault would seem very Kantian. That is, this is a history of the a prioris of knowledge at various moments in historical time. Now, what makes that an ambiguous description of what he does is that this a priori is couched, as it's described by Foucault, is couched in terms of language. So one can also suppose that Foucault's epistemes are not Kantian forms of categories which form the very a prioris of knowledge, but are rather somehow represent the determining operation of a particular set towards or distance from language in its most general sense. And in that sense, then, each of these three epistemes, or maybe four, is not really a Kantian a priori, but merely a different kind of experience of language, ideology of language. Again, it's not clear whether this is at what level of depth this or transcendence this takes place. But from that point of view, then, Foucault's book would, of course, be a much more classically structuralist work, which would somehow describe the determining influence of language and of the way language is conceived on everything else in a historical period. At any rate, Foucault describes the classical episteme in terms of these four categories of the general grammar, and I won't, the propositions, theory of propositions, theory of articulation, theory of designation and of derivation, and I won't spend a lot of time on that now. But the essential, I think, thing for us to notice at this point in a kind of run through again of this historical narrative is that the minute this vision of language changes, nothing holds these levels together anymore. So what one has, and Foucault has his own picture of this, but in my picture you have three lines, three parallels, which then drift apart the way was it South America drifted apart from Africa or whatever. I mean, it's slowly in a kind of what is described here as a geological process, although obviously it was a lot faster than that, is a kind of structural separation such that something new comes into being. But there's no particular telos involved. That is, it's just that this classical episteme was so organized that when it broke down, when it began to fall apart, a new configuration appeared, and this new configuration is the one we still live in, and it has replaced these older objects of knowledge, objects of study, if you like, by ones that are far more recognizable to us, namely linguistics, biology, and economics, or if you prefer, by discourse has been replaced by language. Natural history has been replaced by life, which is a new idea in this period, or a new object of study. And finally, riches have been replaced by work and production. That's not, I think, the way Foucault would like to have us say that, because as far as he's concerned, this is not a question of the older things becoming the newer things, but rather of these older fields breaking down and suddenly new objects coming into being in their out of their ruins. Okay, so this is then the third episteme. Doesn't have as clear a name. It would be, I think, the bourgeois episteme, the historicist episteme, the 19th century episteme, except that it's still ours in many ways. And I think I'll save my discussion of that for a little later, because I think there are a number of things we want to look at. But the essential here is that where all of in the classical period, the three objects of study were somehow homologous, patterned in the same way, now all of a sudden each of these new entities begins to exist on its own and by itself. And that's particularly paradoxical when we have to do with language, because before, language was a kind of transparence. What's meant here by representation is not what many of the writers in this course will mean later on when they use the term representation in a pejorative or polemic way. What's here meant by representation is simply the idea that language really doesn't exist as a separate entity. It isn't seen as a thing or an organism or anything of that kind. It simply is a transparence. It's an element. And it can serve as a vehicle for a non-problematic representation of the organization of any one of these fields. Now, what happens when discourse breaks off, like South America again, and sort of moves geologically in its own direction and becomes an object in its own right and becomes language, is that then language has become something like an object in the world. And then the use of language to describe things is the use of one dimension of the world to describe another, and that's no longer non-problematical, but is indeed very problematical. What happens at this point, of course, is also that this new object suddenly is understood not to be as pure and transparent as logic, but simply to have a history, to be in a process of growth and change, and at that point we get the great 19th century theories of linguistic theories, Grimm's law and Bopp, and the discovery of first of all the discovery of Sanskrit, and then the discovery of the whole history of Indo-European and Indo-Germanic. So this will suddenly determine a very different distance between knowledge and its possibilities and what can be said about the language that knowledge can be conveyed in. Well, at that point, according to Foucault, a new basis for these new sciences has to come into being. they can't be validated any longer by their similarity with each other and then their identity with some universal principle of logic, transparence, discourse, and the like. This new basis, therefore, but it's a very faulty kind of basis, is what Foucault calls, or what Foucault detects through the notion of human sciences. That is, it is the notion of man as an intelligible field of study, or as an intelligible substance, or something of that kind. And for Foucault, this is something which didn't exist before the 19th century. That is, this is Foucault's version, I think I said the other day, of Althusser's critique of humanism. That is that the whole notion of the human, of human sciences, man, humanism in all these various senses, is a new notion. It's contemporary with political liberalism in ways that we'll see in a little bit. And it's an ideological notion which both Foucault and Althusser, in their quite different ways, are concerned to undermine and to discredit. So Foucault is going to show that what are called the human sciences are something like not exactly the breakdown products of this of this whole problem of the human and this whole attempt to ground sciences on ultimately in the human, but they come into being in the space between these various disciplines, and he defines them this way: where in linguistics, in biology, and in, well, he calls it ethnology, economics. I don't know how one would want to define the final area. We're studying, in a sense, the phenomena in themselves. In cultural studies, like literary studies or philosophy, in sociology, and in psychology. These are the human sciences that correspond to the exact sciences. We're studying somehow not the phenomena themselves, but only our representations of these phenomena. That is, sociology doesn't study production, but it studies the way people think about society, the images people have had of society, and all the rest of it. Psychology is not a science like biology or psychoanalysis, but it's rather the study of the representations we have of various types of vital experience or life experience or whatever. So for that reason, these are not, to call them human sciences is to do them a kind of honor which they can't pretend to, since they exist in this no man's land of sheer representation, and they somehow can't be grounded, and they have no ultimate ground, and hence the tendency in all of these so-called human sciences, according to Foucault, for precisely what Ricoeur has called negative hermeneutics. That is, for a constant effort of demystification. Because if you're in a world of sheer representation, if you're in sociology or psychology or culture, you have to constantly be on the alert that your own picture of this field is not itself a representation. That is, there's no way ultimately of grounding the scientificity of any of this stuff. So you have to constantly demystify your own point of view, make sure that you've reckoned into account your own position, your own possibilities of error, your own ideology, and so on and so forth. And this is a never-ending process. So, according to Foucault, and here Foucault gives, I think, a much more structural and a much less positive, if I can say, account of negative hermeneutic or demystification than Ricoeur does. Negative hermeneutic would itself simply be part of the whole vicious circle of the human sciences. That is, it's not it has no real possibilities of its own, but it comes into being as a kind of compensatory attempt to rectify something which is structurally deficient in the human sciences and which can never really be remedied. That is, they can never be put on a scientific framework, since they don't fall under any form of episteme, but are rather what comes in to fill the gaps of these various episteme. Okay, so much, and we'll come back to this description. This is, I think, the polemic part of Foucault's book, and has a lot of interest, but we'll want to use it maybe in a rather different way than the earlier descriptions. But one must add then a kind of indication of maybe a fourth episteme. It's not clear whether this has come into being yet, is coming into being, but it's the idea that if we are becoming aware of this baselessness of the human sciences today, then if we're becoming increasingly aware of the structuring and kind of dominant role of language in epistemes in general, then perhaps it would be possible to feel ourselves on the brink of yet another episteme, a structuralist one say, in which this whole 19th century episteme based on history, on man, on humanism and so on, will disappear and give place to something else that we can't yet imagine. And this is, of course, the most scandalous part of Foucault's book. I don't know. This is the one passage that everyone quotes about the end of, so I might as well quote it too and get it over with, about the end of, let's see, this is pages 384, 385. It will be said that Hölderlin, Hegel, Feuerbach, and Marx all felt this certainty that in them a thought and perhaps a culture were coming to a close, and that from the depths of a distance, again I apologize for this translation, from the depths of a distance which was perhaps not invincible, another was approaching in the dim light of dawn, in the brilliance of noon, or in the dissension of the falling day. But this close, this perilous imminence whose promise we fear today, whose danger we welcome, is probably not of the same order. Then the task enjoined upon thought, then in the 19th century episteme, by that enunciation, was to establish for man a stable sojourn upon this earth from which the gods had turned away or vanished. That is, therefore, the founding of something like a humanism and a human world. In our day, and once again Nietzsche indicated the turning point from a long way off, it is not so much the absence or the death of God that is affirmed as the end of man, that narrow, imperceptible displacement, that recession in the form of identity, which are the reason why man's finitude has become his end. It becomes apparent then that the death of God and the theme of the last man are engaged in a contest with more than one round. Is it not the last man who announces that he has killed God, thus situating his language, his thought, his laughter in the space of that already dead God, yet positing himself also as he who has killed God and whose existence includes the freedom and the decision of that murder? Thus, the last man is at the same time older and yet younger than the death of God. Since he has killed God, it is he himself who must answer for his own finitude, and this is one of the themes of Foucault's description of the so-called human science, is the discovery of finitude as such. But since it is in the death of God that he speaks, thinks, and exists, his murder itself is doomed to die. That is to say, blasphemy presupposes or reinforces religion. That is, if if the universe is really desacralized, then the death of God has itself become a matter of indifference, or it become forgotten, the very importance of the event. New gods, the same gods, are already swelling the future ocean. Man will disappear. Rather than the death of God, or rather in the wake of that death, and in a profound correlation with it, what Nietzsche's thought heralds is the end of his murderer. It is the explosion of man's face in laughter and the return of masks. It is the scattering of the profound stream of time by which he felt himself carried along, and whose pressure he suspected in the very being of things, disappearance of history, continuity. It is the identity of the return of the same, with the absolute dispersal of man. Throughout the 19th century, the end of philosophy and the promise of an approaching culture were no doubt one and the same thing as the thought of finitude and the appearance of man in the field of knowledge. In our day, the fact that philosophy is still and again in the process of coming to an end, and the fact that in it perhaps, though even more outside and against it, in literature as well as in formal reflection, the question of language is being posed, prove no doubt that man is in the process of disappearing. And then the final sentence of the book, one can certainly wager that man would be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. Well, this is, along with Althusser's anti-humanism, the part of the book that's most scandalized people, and I think it has a very clear political intent. That is, the humanism that's meant is obviously not only a philosophical kind. One of the cutting edges of the history of madness was to try to discredit the notion that at the end of the 18th century, think of all the images of the mad imprisoned in Bedlam and tormented and painted up and made to do act out plays for people and so on, or rather to give it in spectacle to people. At the end of the 19th century, suddenly with the coming to power of the middle classes, a new, more benign attitude towards madness as illness came into being with such innovations as the things that were done in Charenton around this time. Well, Foucault, the same theme will come back in the book on prisons, where he's essentially concerned to discredit the idea that after the barbaric spectacles of 17th and 18th century justice, the public torturing and drawing and quartering, the great spectacles of executions and so on. Now, with the middle classes, a new and humanized attitude towards things like penal reform was coming into being. Clearly, something fundamental changed, but Foucault is concerned to show that this new, apparently benign, humanistic attitude towards these various things that are the objects of his various histories, that all of these are, in their own ways, repressive as the repressive apparatuses of the pre-capitalist societies. So this certainly is an attack on our own kind of congratulatory feeling about the way that modern society has evolved. But I think more essentially, in both the case of Althusser and Foucault, that the fundamental thing which is at stake in the attack on humanism is the notion of the human as an intelligible field of study. That is, the idea that there is a complete unit, something which has a kind of autonomy or relative autonomy of its own in human life, in human psychology, in the individual human being, which makes it possible to study this thing in isolation. There you see at once then the connection between that development and what we're going to look at in Flaubert, that is the notion of an individual life as being able to furnish an adequate framework for a narrative. In another direction, you can see the connections between this humanism in the most general sense and the whole economic ideologies and tradition of individualism, as the idea, as it's been, I guess, most dramatically shown in Macpherson's book on possessive individualism, the idea that the juridical values of equality in our society are as much to be understood as the creations of the laying of the basis for the equivalence of labor and for the everyone's possibility to sell to sell their labor in some kind of equal way, as they are to be thought of in terms of values or something, which are values of a philosophical kind that are coming into being. Here, too, later on, we'll want to ask ourselves what the relationship is then between this increasing between an organization of social relations in which all of the monads are somehow equal because they're all there on the marketplace and they're all substitutable for each other. They're freed from the land, from hierarchy and so on, and they bring their individualism, their self to the city, and then they sell that, the labor power of that self. What relationship is to be established between that transformation of organic social relations into juxtaposed into what's the sociologists call Gesellschaft, that is kind of additive agglomeration of individual units, and the development of our notions of the self, our notions of personal identity, our own experience of subjectivity, and the kinds of experience of subjectivity that then suffuse our literature, and in terms of which our modern literature as such, since Romanticism, can be understood. That is, as creating a vehicle for the expression and the production of this new kind of subjective experience, which apparently was not felt important to register in older literary forms. And we'll also want to ask ourselves, and here I'm anticipating a little bit both on later Foucault and on Derrida, what the connection then, or we want to, let's say we'll want to also put this in another set of terms, what's the relationship between this kind of almost spatial equivalence of various beings in society, like so many dots. In Foucault, the image will be quadrillage, that is squaring lines that are squared on paper, and this comes to be the very symbol in Foucault of modern society. What's the relationship between that, if that's really the new space, experiential space of modern society, and the whole notion of centeredness, which is apparently related to our experience of the self, our experience of consciousness, and which will be one of Derrida's important themes. How can one, isn't there something paradoxical about suggesting on the one hand that society has broken up into a kind of mechanistic, additive juxtaposition of equivalent entities, and on the other that we're dominated by a whole ideology of centeredness, of the center, of the privileging of our own consciousness, and so on and so forth. Okay, now let me now, that then is a kind of overview of les mots et les choses, of the order of things. Let me now go back to this period of the Renaissance for a moment, because I wanted to show you how to each of these epistemes corresponds a certain form of, a certain concept of interpretation. And we'll want to ask ourselves then, to what interpretation corresponds in Foucault's own work, if that is indeed something different from those other three epistemes. We said a word already about the 19th century episteme, the way that there seems to be some privileged relationship between demystification and the experience of this 19th century episteme. In the Renaissance, we said that was related to the notion of language as an object. Well, in the Renaissance, language is also, in Foucault's description, language is also an object, but of a somewhat different kind. That is, language is not felt to be a separate entity in the world that has its history, its own inner laws, its own dynamism, utterly unlike any other kind of entity in the world, but rather it's simply language, speech, words, and so on are simply part of the very objective fabric of the world. So that's the sense in which the world is a book. Not only because the various objects of the world are things that you can read, so you find a peculiar animal and then you establish you take that as a sign or almost a parole, a statement, a proposition about the relationship between the color of the animal, its habitat, its poison, and all the rest of it, its habits. And so this animal comes to be a kind of divine, or ultimately divine poem, if you like, or a poetic object or sign or image or something, which has a meaning that then we want to decipher. But so not only is this true of the objects of the world, but it's also true of words, which are objects and which then also can be deciphered, just like animals in a bestiary, because you look at a word, you make up a folk etymology for it. You say that it has a certain kind of sound, which means this and that. And so words are treated exactly like things, and both of them are then become signs. Now, the section that I wanted to, I'm not sure if I read this before. It's not long. That I wanted to read to you is Foucault's description of the ternary system of signs in the Renaissance. I don't think I read this last time, did I? Well, it's not long. He says that unlike the classical episteme, again, where we have discourse and things, les mots et les choses, we have a dual system where we talk about things and they're out there, and the very operation of language passes between these two poles. In the Renaissance, as in our time, it's a ternary system in which we have language, we have a text, and we have a commentary. Now, a language is not, again, where you might think. It's not people speaking, it's the world. That's the language. Underneath the world is what you find when you read the book of the world. That is, its text. It's hidden away. You have to decipher it. And, of course, the way we do this reading is by then commenting and writing our own commentaries on this text. Hence, this threefold vision of language. Let's see, language exists, first of all, in its raw and primitive being, in the simple natural form of writing, a stigma upon things, a mark imprinted across the world, which is part of its most ineffaceable forms. That is, writing is also, these animals in the bestiary are also writing in that sense. In a sense, this layer of language is unique and absolute, but it also gives rise to two other forms of discourse which provide it with a frame. Above it, there is commentary, which recasts the given signs, the animals, the bestiary, recast the animals into the form of a bestiary, which recast the given signs to serve a new purpose, and below it, the text, whose primacy is presupposed by commentary to exist hidden beneath the marks visible to all. Hence, there are three levels of language, all based on the single being of the written word. It is this complex interaction of elements and so which was to disappear. Okay, now I want now to return to the discussion of the hermeneutics of restoration by presenting very briefly the most complicated model of this kind of hermeneutic and of this kind of view of language that we have in our tradition, although I think other theological traditions have things even more wildly complicated. But this is, I think, very important and interesting for us, since it is still the most complex model of interpretation that we have, and one of the most interesting and sophisticated views of the critical act, which we have in our tradition, even though we don't normally talk about it when we're writing a history of criticism or looking at ways people have invented to deal with culture. This is the famous so-called medieval four levels of writing, and that would then be another pretext for writing something on this board. If you can simply imagine four lines, the bottom one of which is the literal level, the next one of which is the allegorical level, And finally, and I guess these have to ascend because somehow that's part of the spatial disposition of this. You notice even Foucault talked about the commentary being above the text, whatever that would mean. Next, the third level up would be the moral level, and finally the anagogical level. Now, this is first of all, this scheme of things is developed, and it seems, for one reason or another, if you're interested in numerology, that there's something privileged about the number 4. That is, there's another scheme of interpretation that's practiced in the early Middle Ages, or in the late classical period, which is a kind of rival to this, which is the allegorical system of Philo of Alexandria based on 3. But this is utterly irreconcilable with the fourfold system, and it might be interesting to say why. Philo invented the method of reading, for example, of allegory, allegorical analysis. The system of the 4 levels. For a reason I'm going to say, namely that the system of the 4 levels is an interpretation of a narrative in terms of a narrative. Where in Philo, it's an interpretation of a narrative in terms of a static system of one kind or another, whether ethical, psychological, physical, or whatever. And this is a fundamental difference which can't be overcome. It would also seem, at least gather throughout the Middle Ages, there was a lot of discussion of this, and it was felt that even if you could imagine more than 4 levels, they would all ultimately be reducible back to the 4. That is, people obviously went as far as 7, since that's an even more magical number. But of these 7 levels, of the variations that were evolved and were thought to represent new structural possibilities of interpretation, it was generally, it seems to have generally been agreed that these various new versions were really only reworkings of the fundamental levels themselves. For example, I'll just give this one example, there is a kind of allegorical analysis which reads texts in terms not of the life of Christ, but of the history of the church. Well, but from another point of view, those are exactly the same. And so we can't speak of a 5th level or a 6th level, but rather that's only one of the 4, and so on. Okay, how do these 4 work? Well, first of all, as I say, the very project of a hermeneutics comes into existence for reasons as a function of a very specific type of historical situation. One in which a culture is to be, an alien culture is to be assimilated. Now, in the case of the 4 levels, the alien culture is obviously the Old Testament, which has to now be assimilated to Christianity. And which is both an alien language, an alien culture, and all the rest. In our own time, if the whole question of hermeneutics has reappeared, it's obviously first of all been in the 18th and early 19th century because of the development of philology and the need now to assimilate in some with an awareness of much sharper awareness of cultural and historical difference, to assimilate that now henceforth alien culture, which is that of the classical world, into modern thought. And in our time, of course, it's the very opening of our own culture onto world culture in general. That is the fact that this is now a world system and a universal society, and that henceforth now we have to deal with traditions which are very different from ours, and find some way of reading them, of assimilating them into our own way of looking at things. Now, very rapidly, the way this works, and I'm spending a little time on this because I think it is of more than antiquarian interest. The way this works is that the literal level is understood to be a level of a textual phenomenon which has some historical existence or truth, if you prefer. The point is not that the Old Testament is literally true, because it's not the Old Testament that's being interpreted, it's the events of the Old Testament that are being interpreted, and those are literally true. There is a problem that arises the minute one tries to apply this, again, as I say, to some kind of fictive discourse. And I suppose in Dante it would be the idea, the literal level would be not so much the fictive poem itself, as rather the literal text, geographical text of this worldview in which space was disposed in the way it is in Dante. Now, the object then is to rewrite this first literal level, that of the Old Testament, in terms of the New. So one would say that then it's the second level which is going to be the decisive one, because that's the moment when suddenly we break out of our sense of the text as simply being a text, and it is endowed with a kind of allegorical significance. That is, it means something else. It means not only what it means in itself, but it also means more than that, other than that, and so forth. The allegorical level is, the principal version of it is the life of Christ. And the minute that's given, but the life of Christ is a narrative. So what's happening is that one narrative, the histories of the Old Testament, are now being interpreted, that is to say, rewritten in terms of another narrative, not of an abstract system or a static system, but they are being rewritten in terms of the life of Christ. And so the people of Israel going down into Egypt is then read as Christ dying on the cross and going into hell. The passage of the Red Sea is then Christ's resurrection, and so forth. So one can say that the second level is both decisive and is a very odd level, because it's not one could just as easily say it was a key to interpretation itself, as a code. It furnishes the basic interpretive code just as much as it represents a level in the text. Okay, well, once the text is opened up in that way, once you've been able to demonstrate, let's say, the principle of the existence of a code, the very fact of interpretation itself, the very fact of rewriting one text in terms of another, or in terms of something else, then at that point, structurally, the other levels are produced. And they are, I think, very interesting. And if it's so that these are all the levels that we can find, that if there is a kind of structural limit to this interpretive act, then I think it's interesting that they should be the levels that they are, because the moral level then rewrites this whole business in terms of the life or experience of the individual believer, or the individual soul. So, at that point, being sold into Egypt is the state of my soul in sin. The passage of the Red Sea, the emergence from Egypt, is my individual conversion. Finally, with the anagogical level, we have a new interpretation, no longer in terms of the individual soul, but in terms of the collectivity. That is, this is the level of the Last Judgment. This is the way in which all of the human race in which the Old Testament story is the story of the destiny of the human race itself in the Last Judgment. And at that point, then, the descent into Egypt is Armageddon, I guess, and the emergence from Egypt is the end of the world. Now, from our vantage point today, What we can sort of rewrite this scheme as follows, it seems to me. We have a text. The second level is an interpretive code. And the third and fourth levels are something like the psychological and the collective or political reading of this text in terms of that code. And these are apparently structural possibilities or variants which are somehow seem to exhaust a certain number of possibilities and correspond, I think, taken now, if we take this scheme in its broadest sense, correspond to options in criticism today, that is, to a psychoanalytic option or a Marxian or a political reading. Now, I think, having looked at the problem of interpretation in terms of this old but very powerful model, we can return to, not only to recur, but to a whole tradition of a hermeneutics of restoration and ask some interesting questions of it. I would say that I think it's very important to see Frye's work in this framework. And the text of Frye that I would have wanted to quote to you, it's some length, but it's in Anatomy of Criticism, and I think I can kind of paraphrase it, has to do precisely with the way Frye construes what I think, I don't know if he would accept the word, but what is certainly in his terms a hermeneutics of restoration, a hermeneutics of the recovery of original meaning, and also something which I think is not so much the case in quite that way in Recur, a hermeneutics which wishes to be a mode of social interpretation, because Frye has said, as you know, that his criticism is ultimately is one which his interpretation is ultimately one which is founded on the notion of the collectivity or the community. And so this, I think, gives us a transitional form, if you like, between the older theological tradition of the meaning that a text had and that you have to recover, and a newer, more secular, more political kind of set of questions one might ask of a text. Now, what's very interesting in Frye's way of doing this is the way he construes these final levels. If you look at this passage, I'll give you this reference next time if you're interested. But if you look at this passage, it's in the section on archetypal criticism, I think. He distinguishes what he calls between what he calls the archetypal level and the anagogical level. And if you look at the fourfold system, you see that Frye has inverted this system. That is, he says, all right, one level, a very, well, again, is it a deep one or a high one? I'm not sure. One very fundamental level of interpretation is when we're able to move by way of the replacing of the text in a kind of more completed mythic cycle and so on. We're able to move from the form of the text or the form which is revealed when we replace the fragmentary text in a larger pattern, which is for Frye the sort of total text. When we're able to move from that form to the origins of that form in the unity of the collectivity. That is, when we see that myths follow the cycle of the seasons, what we come to then in that mode of interpreting is not just, we don't stop at the level of primitive thought or cosmology or anything. Rather, the very rhythm of the seasons, the notion of the cycle, the completeness of nature and so on, is the external form and image of the unity of the collectivity. So we have a mediation by which we pass from, we have several. We pass in Frye from the individual text to, we rewrite the text in terms of a more complete cycle. We see that cycle in terms of ritual, and then, and this is very decisive, and I think it's not always noticed by readers of Frye, we rewrite that cycle in collective, which is to say, essentially, political or social terms. Now, this is, I think, the point at which it would be interesting to sort of explore the intersection between that view of I think it shouldn't be called, let's say, the religious in its modern form, the sacred, rather, that view of the sacred of primitive religion. And on the one hand, let's say, Feuerbach, who saw in religion, because Feuerbach isn't only demystifying of religion, who saw in religion a kind of distorted, if you like, but still projection of the collectivity in ideal forms. And another intersection would be furnished by Durkheim's view that religion is essentially the celebration, the symbolic celebration and symbolic act whereby a tribe or a given society reconfirms its unity, and that is indeed its social functionality. Now, that's already very interesting in itself, and there one has to, I think, ask Frye a question which I think it's clear that Ricoeur would not have to be asked in quite those terms, namely because Ricoeur seems to tell us that today, if we want to get back to a hermeneutics of restoration, if we want to find out the positive content of any charismatic product or text, we have to pass through demystification. Now, it seems to me in Frye we don't have that movement. That is, we haven't reached this deeper collective content of the work by passing through any type of demystification or ideological analysis. And hence, one must ask Frye a much more basic question, which is what the survival and persistence of these fundamental collective vibrations and messages can be in a society which is no longer a unified society, in a society which no longer has the vitality of primitive tribal cultures, but which is in full dissolution and undergoing the very movement of history itself. That seems to me to be, yes. Yeah. Let me finish with Frye, though, could I? Because I want to get back. There's this other level of Frye that I want to mention, and then I'll give you the floor. Okay, now this is then a moment when Frye arrives at a mode of interpretation in terms of the social. But what happens in the Anatomy of Criticism is that he says, but this rewriting of the text in terms of the collective is not the ultimate form that meaning can take. And this is the Blakean, obviously the Blakean inspiration of Frye. Beyond the collective, beyond the tale of the tribe, there is the whole notion of the transfigured body. And let's say libidinal, the libidinal utopia of. So he says beyond the notion of nature, of the stars as reflecting the unity of the collectivity and so on. There's the notion that all nature is a single body, all culture, all society is itself a single physical form, and so forth. And it's and this then for Frye is the ultimate level of interpretation, the ultimate utopian message that the work can generate. But it seems to me that it's very interesting, in the light of the four levels, that the four levels work the other way. That is, they took, or we can at least use this inversion of these levels to rewrite Frye in the other way around. That they see the interpretation of the experience of the individual, the vision that the individual would have of salvation, and I would say in our time clearly that would not be expressed in theological terms, but again in the libidinal terms of the kinds of utopias of Brown or Marcuse or whatever, or Blake, you know. But this is the level of the moral, and it is the unity of the body which is itself the symbol of the unity of the collectivity rather than the other way around. So it seems to me that it's that which allows us to rewrite some of this material in terms of an ultimate level of interpretation, which would be that of the collective. Okay, I think it probably is the moment for me to make at least a pause, if not a stop here. So maybe you want to.
Question that arises from the relationship between what you said about differing problems of interpretation and the notion of fourfold reading, which was something that came up quite recently, with your opening remark about the difference between an action and life. Because it's quite true to say that the development of any kind of historical narrative or a narrative that can be interpreted is really the development from the life to the action. That is, away from the notion, say, in Tacitus, that history is a matter of virtues and vices, toward the notion that it really is, in Danto's sense, intent to interpret a change of affairs from one state to another. But it seems to me that what has been uncovered, and something that Foucault keeps slipping into and out of, is the very real problem that if a life is difficult to define or give a kind of narrative shape to, the same thing is true of an action. Because, for example, what constitutes an event, what constitutes a fact in history, as Levi-Strauss has pointed out, is itself a very real difficulty. It's something that is constantly raising a problem. And when one finds mode of interpretation, such as, say, the fourfold level, Paul's approach to interpretation, I think one has to recognize that you've misstated the distinction. The really important and striking difference between that, say, and that of Philo is not that it is the interpretation of one narrative in terms of another, though of course it is that, but rather it is that interpretation of one narrative in terms of another because the first narrative and the narrative that is going to be interpreted again as, or different terms as, is thought to be quite literally true, to be a sacred text, a sacred story. And I think this is important because the only kind of story that is worth retelling in different terms is a story that is thought to be true. And this problem comes up very strongly, I think, because in medieval interpretation, that fourfold level was never used except for texts that were thought to have that status, or narratives thought to have that character, or those that were seen like the Divine Comedy to be analogous to it. And this is what brings me to the relation between Foucault, let's say, and Frye and others. And that is that in using that type of level of interpretation, what they're in fact doing is recreating what Foucault calls the episteme. That is to say, essentially a series of states that are meant to take the place of a narrative that has not in fact been provided. That is, as you pointed out yourself, the spaces between the epistemes, one of the big differences, they are all trying to replace narrative with a form of determinism. You know, the last pages of the order of things is very much like certain pages you find in Frye, and the grandfather of them all is the type of the order of explanation that Steiner uses in The Decline of the West. Remember, he agrees that certain forms of geometrical shapes will be the episteme for that society, classical, round, and so on, like modern reading. So I think that what we're really seeing here in Foucault and in your exposition of Foucault is a sidestepping of the central question, which is that if the notion of life is not satisfactory as a biographical construct, the action that takes its place and the history that we made in that is even more problematic, and the problem remains.
Well, the word life is going to give us some problems, I think, because clearly it would be nice to have a piece of jargon to talk about narratives written in the form of a life like that of Félicité, in order to distinguish that from the question of life in the Romantic period or whatever. So maybe later on, maybe when we talk about Flaubert, we can try to sort that out a little more precisely. I think that there is obviously there is the problem that you point out about the order of things. The reason the Prisons book is interesting, and the reason I want to make a kind of brief presentation of that at some point, is that there we see the scheme, this abstract, even Spenglerian scheme, if you like, of the order of things breaking upon some more fundamental historical facts or facts of historical development and having to reconstitute itself in very interesting ways in a narrative form, and having to now abandon the rigidity of this determination by worldviews, and that's already very problematical in Foucault, because he keeps telling us this is not a question of worldviews, he's not a historian of ideas, and so on and so on. These are not homologies, but what are they? Well, it's that which will break up in the Prison's book and give place to much more complicated and interesting kind of movement. So we'll come back to that later, and I think that can maybe furnish some material for this theme of historiography I mentioned before. Now, on the business of the literal truth of the text, I think that's very important, and it's clear that even the Divine Comedy is embarrassing for the fourfold level, because it isn't true. It is a dream and a fiction and so on. And the fourfold level is apparently not generalizable to literature, because it can only be about the truth, and that, therefore, the historical truth, the Old Testament, and so forth. Now, what I would propose is that something like this becomes possible for us again when we reinvent a similar notion of textual truth. That is to say, when we do away with the old problem of the fictive and fiction and of science versus poetry, which has been sort of a kind of dominant ideological motif of much of, aesthetics, really, all of classical aesthetics, and try to replace it with something else. That is, it's clear that and I think we can do that now, because while it's always been clear that Flaubert's text is fictive, it's only now becoming clear to us that everything else is fictive in that sense too, and that Foucault's histories are just as fictive. So the concept is breaking up, I think, under its own weight in that way. I think I don't happen to mind this terminology of charisma and so on, and that if it offends people, they can try to think of a different terminology that they prefer. It seems to me that a criticism in social terms, a Marxist hermeneutics, would be only too willing to admit something like a notion of charisma, namely that through all of these texts are in some way are in the sense of the fourfold levels historically true. That is not to say that that they're true in any representational sense, but that they have this resonance of a historical object, and that their truth is that of a historical object. That what speaks through them is the, and these words for it are too poor, I think, and too crude or cut and dry, something like the whole truth of this historical moment itself, or of this particular mode of production, or whatever. I can maybe see the problem with the notion of charisma is that it seems to be personalized. That is, even if the voice is not personalized, it's addressing itself to a person, and that's already a difficulty. My formula for this question, for this business of interpretation, is that one can get out of the dilemmas of the problem of historicism was that they kept the subject on one end of the chain of interpretation. That is, they saw that the works of the past were both individual products, which, however, were somehow characteristic in a kind of aesthetic way of a whole culture in some larger sense. But their individual work, whether of Dilthey or Meineke or anybody else, was somehow the work of an individual subject alone. And all of the dilemmas of historicism, it seems to me, come from that is the whole problem of relativism. If each individual subject is going to reinterpret the past in terms of his own temperament and all the rest, I'm mixing my historical movements here. Then, of course, there isn't any past, or there's a kind of absolute relativity of the past, and so forth. It seems to me that, on the contrary, we should see the interpretive act in a different way. We should see it as a relationship between subjects, between our own individual capacities of reading and all the rest of our individual histories that comes from, and an individual work. But we should see those two, that relationship between an individual subject and an individual object, as being itself the mediation for a confrontation between two different social forms. And it seems to me that what happens in interpretation in our relationship to the past is that our moment of history is being placed in question, interrogated, judged by another moment of history, or another mode of production, I would even say, since the farther away this past is, the more radical will be the way it puts us again into question. And I think if one sees interpretation in that way, the problems which arise when one is locked into the interpretive process in the categories of the individual are dissolved. And it's clear then that any of our individual interpretations is also a larger symbolic act by which the past, and I mean the past now in the Marxian view of radically different modes of production from ours, constitutes itself in judgment on our own present.
But in the development of interpretation, what actually happened was not this collapse or staggering from a sense of collectivity that was total to a sense of individualism and relativism that was other, because there was that long period which you get to the Enlightenment in the 19th century in which the first form of relativism that appeared was not individual but collective and cultural. That is, and there's a beautiful example of exactly the process we were talking about in the hermeneutic, the higher criticism of the late 18th, early 19th century, because this process of interpretation by accommodating or mediating one level to another order of understanding occurred when the biblical narrative was being accommodated to or in some way reinterpreted in terms of a mythic order that had become known to people precisely because of the development of cultural relativism during the 18th century. Otherwise, there would have been no interest. Fry's whole achievement is to redo a higher criticism in which the literary text takes the place of the sacred text. But in both cases, what replaces them is the myth.
Well, I don't know that I would want to add that. But I think clearly, one is still locked into cultural relativism if one doesn't have the idea of the sequence of the modes of production. That is, of an evolution of a meaningful evolution of social forms. If there's just a multiplicity of various social forms, an infinity of them, and they really stand in no kind of economic or political relationship to each other, then in a way this whole relationship to the past has to be reduced to aesthetic appreciation in the more trivial sense of the word. That is, we appreciate the variety of the other cultures, we thus learn the variety of the human, and so on and so on. But our culture is not judged in return by them, because there's no, in Foucault's terms, there's no identity which would underline those differences. And I think it's only the notion of modes of production which supplies a way where we can understand radical historical difference in terms of some fundamental identity. But that, I think, is something we'll want to save also for later on.
But that's precisely what happened in this period. That is, that European societies saw themselves as being judged by their discoveries about other cultures. That is, relativism does not mean, I think, simply that type of aesthetic or escapist enjoyment.
Well, but at that point, it isn't. Insofar as judgment is involved, I think it ceases to be relativism. So,
yeah, I don't yet make the connection from your discussion of Frye in relation to the medieval fourfold level of interpretation to Ricoeur's poles of hermeneutics. And in particular, I think the problem I'm stuck on is the status of the symbol for Ricoeur and the way in which the intersubjective relationship between reader and text that you referred to a few moments ago as an individual or a particular one can be translated into a general or a universal one. It sounds to me as if the criterion of society or collectivity in sociological terms is being simply imposed, where I would prefer to see some explanation of how the experience of reading leads to an awareness of this generic or universal dimension. I'm not sure that it can be defined in strictly historical or sociological terms.
Those are two somewhat different problems. That is, on the one hand, is this: can one find a place for negative hermeneutics, demystification, and so on, in something like this fourfold scheme, in something which would be a scheme of the restoration of meaning? Which I think that's a somewhat different, I mean, all these are related, but that's a somewhat different issue from the one of where society comes from, whether that isn't one more arbitrary code among others. I mean, some of us like to read these things in terms of society. Well, that's our, but if we're interested in psychoanalysis, we might want to do it. In other words, is there not something fundamentally arbitrary about that? Is not that which I've given as the anagogical level of all interpretation merely one code among others, which lacks its own justification? I think it's a mistake to appeal to the experience of reading, because that's a mystified experience like everything else, and I don't think there's anything in the experience of reading itself that can necessarily demystify itself and spring out of its own limits, except insofar, I think, as these I think one can show as a kind of empirical fact that all of the kinds of interpretation which stop short of this know a kind of return of the repressed, in that they reestablish it mythically or in other ways. So I think one could take individual critical systems, various models of interpretive acts that we know in contemporary criticism, and show the ones that refuse, let's say, the social as an ultimate kind of horizon of meaning. And one can show how those interpretive models are crippled by their refusal of the social or by their repression of the social. But to put it that way is simply to state it in the form of an opinion. I mean, one would have to then look at these things and show why that's the case. Now, the other question I think is in some ways harder. I mean, well, first of all, it asks us whether the fourfold model is of any use is really of use in dealing with the negative and demystifying side of things. It seems to me that those are implicit. Those are only implicit in it. That is, they're implicit, for example, in this whole question of literal meaning we were just talking about, in the whole need for interpretation itself. As long as the text is sort of locked into its own autonomy, as long as it seems to be readable in a kind of absolutely intrinsic way, then of course this movement of interpretation doesn't come about, and it's at that point that all of the various forms of repression, or what's Foucault's word, the unthought, is that what he says, the impensé, or the unconscious, and so on, all of those things are in force. So I suppose you could say, well, the minute you unlock the text and engage in an interpretive process that leads towards these larger horizons, you've already, in some sense, overcome those things. That's not a really adequate answer, but it has to do with the value of that model. Then the other thing is that I think we haven't really begun to make an inventory of the various kinds of ideological analysis that are possible. I think, and so these positive, I'm going to call these positive meanings, the positive hermeneutics, the aim of the positive hermeneutics, the whole notion of the restoration of meaning, I'm going to call that, for better or for worse, the utopian dimension of the work. Seems to me that even though we're not very clear about that, that's a lot easier to grasp than what might be the other, in the stronger sense of the term, ideological part of the work, that is that which has to be demystified and so forth. And that's one of the things I would like to do in this course, not only to take an inventory of these various kinds of ideological analysis, but then ask, for example, what help Foucault is to us, among others, or Derrida, as a model of this kind of thing. So that's, for me, an open line of research, and not other. comments or questions or intervention in the French sense? Okay, then I think we will concentrate on Flaubert tomorrow morning, and next week the text that I've suggested you read, I don't know whether we'll get to them by next time, but I'm moving from this question of quadrillage, lining, and so on, to the whole question of rationalization. There, the basic texts are the two chapters of Dialectic of Enlightenment that I suggested, and they turn out to be the concept of enlightenment and the culture industry. Behind those...
It's a bit different from what you got there.
Well, I'll be talking about the Surveiller et Punir too. Well, I don't think we'll get to Conrad, but we may get to the Adorno and Horkheimer. Behind those texts is another fundamental one, which is not on this list, and which is Lukács's great essay on reification in history and class consciousness. And behind that is Max Weber, but I really don't have an individual text unless you want to reread the Protestant Ethic to give you for that. But those are the outside parameters of that discussion when we get that far.
Just remind you about those who are interested in the discussion group, if you just wait behind a few moments.